Hello and welcome back to Mug of Research. Today is day 7 of Mug of Research, which is actually the last in this series of Mug of Research. Now, I may go on and do a little bumper episode where I share some of my top tips for the third sector in how to achieve policy influence. But today I'm going to be talking about the future of equality strategies. And I'll be talking about that particularly here in Wales. So if you're interested in that, then be sure to grab your nicest mug and we'll dive into Mug of Research. Okay, so I always start these episodes just by pointing out that if you'd like some background on the partnership that I was researching, or if you'd like an explanation as to why I'm doing these videos, then please go back and watch the introductory video. I'm going to start today by pointing out that I'm actually really proud of what we've achieved here in Wales in the last 25 years in terms of promoting and advancing equalities. In fact, some of you may be unaware that even at the point before devolution, there was a lot of pre-devolutionary rhetoric that was talking about the importance of having inclusive governance in Wales. And then at the point of devolution, when the Government of Wales Act 1998 was written, they introduced an Equalities clause into that Act. And when it was replaced by the Government of Wales Act 2006, that Equalities clause was still there. It's section 77 of the Government of Wales Act. What the Equalities Clause means is that the government has a statutory duty to promote equality of opportunity in the exercise of all of its devolved functions. And what that means for Welsh Government ministers is that they're required to have a due regard to the principle that there should be equality of opportunity for all people. Now, because that's written into legislation, which is seen as being really innovative, that has had an impact on the ways of working here in Wales. And one of the examples that many academics point to is the example of mainstreaming equalities, which is a policy that was adopted in those early days of devolution. So yes, back in 2004, there was definitely a commitment to mainstreaming. In 2006, there was a strategy that reasserted that commitment to mainstreaming. So when I came to do my interviews, I was obviously interested to find out whether or not the policy actors I was speaking to felt that this partnership was a useful mechanism by which they could achieve mainstreaming. Fascinatingly, one of the things that I found was that actually there was a real resistance against this term mainstreaming. In fact, they were concerned about it, and I would say that there was a whole-scale rejection of the notion of equality as mainstreaming, which was a surprise to me. And there were two reasons that they would commonly give as to why they might be rejecting mainstreaming. Some participants would explain to me that mainstreaming means equality impact assessments, and equality impact assessments are done just before policy gets made within Welsh Government. And what they would say the problem is with mainstreaming equalities is that actually there should be more to promoting equalities than simply equality impact assessments, which of course they're right. However, equality impact assessments are a tool of mainstreaming. They're not the same thing as mainstreaming. In fact, academics who are interested in mainstreaming have described a whole series of tools, so they're just one of the mainstreaming tools. So it's interesting that there was this confusion between mainstreaming and one particular mainstreaming tool, which is equality impact assessments. The second reason that my participants would give me as to why they would reject mainstreaming is that they'd explain that mainstreaming means everybody shares the responsibility of pursuing equalities, which sounds great on the surface, but then, as they pointed out, if you make equalities everybody's responsibility, it's actually nobody's responsibility to take it forward, and equalities just gets lost in the background of what's being achieved. Now, that is a really interesting argument, but one of the things that interests me about it is that's a very different interpretation of the meaning of mainstreaming than how it was originally conceived. So, brilliantly, here in Wales, we had one of the leading experts of mainstreaming influencing our understanding of mainstreaming, and her name is Teresa Rees. Now, what Teresa Rees said, she defined mainstreaming as the systematic integration of equalities into all systems and structures, into all policies, processes and procedures. In fact, Velou described mainstreaming, and she simply described it as the advancing of all policies at all levels and at all stages. So if you compare that understanding of mainstreaming from the one that most people have come to understand now, which is that everybody shares responsibility of pursuing equalities, you can see that they're two very different things. That's not what was meant by mainstreaming. Now, what I then went on to do was to ask many of my participants how they felt that equalities organisations had had an impact on policies in Wales and through the partnership. And they'd often point to this extraordinary impact that equalities organisations had had on policy within Wales. They talk about at the highest point in terms of law. And an example of equalities law would be, for example, the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act of 2015. Or they talk about guidance. An example of that would be the Relationship and Sexuality Education in Schools guidance. Or they talk about kind of at the level of implementation, the kind of documents that might be produced to try and influence implementation, like the Framework for Action that was produced on tackling hate crimes and incidents. But what's fascinating is they weren't just pointing to equalities policies when they were explaining how equalities organisations had an influence. So a lot of the time they talk about how equalities organisations had influence on wider policies of Welsh Government. For example, it's well recognised that the disability organisations had a really significant input into the Social Services and Wellbeing Act of 2014. Or there was quite a number of equalities organisations that sought to have an influence on the Welsh education curriculum. So they're really trying to have an influence on the implementation of this curriculum. For example, race equality organisations really wanted some understanding of race equality. In fact, if you really want to point to an example of how equalities was embedded across everything that was happening within Welsh Government, then a really classic example is that commitment to become a feminist government, by which they then went on to produce that series of rapid reviews into gender equality within Wales. So you can see that what we saw in the policies and in the way that equalities organisations were having an influence on things within government is that, yes, equalities really was being embedded in all policies at all levels and at all stages. So it seems then that mainstreaming really has been being achieved within Welsh Government, even though at the same time now key policy actors are kind of pushing against the idea of mainstreaming. So then I need to think about what kind of policy recommendations I would make on this. And in order to do that, I do need to give you a little background on a particular approach that I took in my thesis. I was using something called feminist institutionalism to try and interpret the partnership that I was looking at. Now, I won't go into the nitty-gritty of the theory behind feminist institutionalism, but the one thing I do want to point out in terms of an institutionalist approach is really recognising that in an institution you have both these formal rules that might be in place or formal structures and processes, but you also have a whole series of informal norms or practices, a whole series of informal conventions. And one of the arguments that I made at the end of my thesis in my PhD was that actually you can have an institutionalist approach as a strategy for equalities. So my final recommendation that for my mugs of research is actually goes out to academics first, to take on board the way that practitioners feel about this terminology of mainstreaming. But in fact, maybe to start talking instead of framing this new strategy in terms of institutionalising equalities. And if we start to take this kind of approach of institutionalising equalities, we can capture all of the successes of mainstreaming, but we can also move forward and start to really unpick some of the ways that we can achieve equalities through informal processes as well. And that way we're really tackling structural inequality. So if we talk about institutionalising equalities, this has an added bonus because, of course, Welsh Government had written into their equalities clause that they would consider all people. And then that really opens up new opportunities for really achieving intersectionality in policy making so that Welsh Government can continue to advance equalities in new and innovative ways. So that's it, my final recommendation for Mug of Research. Why don't we consider institutionalising equalities as our equality strategy here in Wales? I want to say thank you for watching to the end of this video, and thank you for watching any of the other Mugs of Research videos that you've participated in. And of course, finally, I just want to really thank those extraordinary participants that I spoke to in Welsh Government, in the Equalities third sector, and within WCVA. You were fantastic. I really enjoyed working with you. I've really enjoyed my research with you. Diolch yn fawr.